Right, it's Matt Thomas here from King Unique with the Minimoog. Stroke Minimoog. Now this is the Arturia version. Why are we using the Arturia version? Because it's the one which looks most like the original. So we're going to have something to refer to that we understand as a Minimoog, whereas the other guys do much the same signal path. The visible outward appearance is quite different. So the Arturia Mini V looks like a Minimoog, and apart from one or two additions on this panel, it behaves pretty much the same as well. We've got extra fancies hidden away up here, as Arturia are fond of doing. There you go, all the extra biz. But if we stay on the front panel, apart from one or two little additions like the sync here and the polyphonic switch, this is the layout of a Minimoog. So why is it so fabulously simple and wonderful and everybody loves it? Well, let's look now. We'll work from left to right. This whole idea of working from left to right, if you've been through any of these synth courses with me, you'll see I often do this left to right signal flow thing. Well, the Minimoog is where that starts. That's part of what made it such an accessible breakthrough. Previously, all your modulars had these different modules stacked around in a cabinet, however you wanted them, and it's up to you to make sense of that. The Minimoog systemized this into the idea that a signal could be seen to flow across the keyboard from left to right. So let's look at that idea. We've got controllers, oscillator bank, mixer, modifiers, output. So the controllers, the glide, the tune, and the modulation, these, along with the keyboard, set what happens to the sounds created in the oscillator bank. So the controllers, the pitch inputs, the gliding, the wobbling, etc., has its effect on the oscillators, the sound generating part of the synthesizer, where we have these three oscillators. The sound of these three oscillators is then put into a mixer where they can be balanced up against each other. Some white noise can be added and also an external input, so another sound from outside the synth. These are all balanced up together to create the sound you want, and they then go into modifiers. So the sound is modified by passing through a filter, and it also has its volume controlled by a loudness contour, and the shape of the filter is controlled by a filter envelope here. Last of all this is put to the output section where we decide how loudly it comes out of the synth. So we've controlled what happens to this pitch of the sound, we generate that sound, it gets mixed, it gets modified, it gets output. So let's get started using one of Arturia's template patches, a really simple one. We'll go down to here to template, one osc. There you go, a really simple sawtooth, one oscillator, nothing else sounding. Going to make a couple of quick changes just for convenience sake. Down here, some few additional parameters that Arturia have added because, of course, this Minimoog can be used polyphonically and all kinds of stuff the original couldn't. I want it to behave how a real Moog would have done. So polyphony should be 1. It's a monophonic one-voice instrument. Now, play mode, I'm going to switch to last just because it makes it easier for me to quickly just play any riffs without having to think about whether I'm playing a low or a high note. We'll cover all this in depth later, but for now, just quickly put yourself on play mode last, poly 1. And now we're going to work our way from left to right, just as the design is intended. So the first parameter we're going to see is glide. Now, this isn't necessarily the first parameter I would go for to explore a new synth, but let's just do this left to right thing, and we'll see how the designer's thinking works. Okay, now glide is the time it takes a note to move from one key to the next. So you can see the pitch instantly jumps. Now I can make that longer, but no effect because down here there is a glide on switch. If that's off, this does nothing. So glide on, and now you can see the glide is now slurring from one pitch to the other. And the longer I make that, you can see the high values take really quite a long time. Okay, so that's glide, very simple. Next is tune. 3 semitones plus or minus, just simply so you can tune this Moog into any other instruments you're playing with. In the days of the Moog's own oscillators drifting all over the place, this kind of got quite a lot of use. Trying to stay in line with your bandmates. In a DAW, you're probably going to leave it there most of the time. Mod mix. The modulation section of the Minimoog is controlled by the mod wheel here. Modulation lets us effectively change the settings of, in this case, either pitch or the filter cutoff. We have two switches to route the modulation onwards. So that's where the destinations are going to be. But the first thing you decide here is what will be the modulation source. What signal is going to be used to change these other values of pitch and filter cutoff. So you have a choice of oscillator 3 can be taken and used as a modulator, not just a sound source. You can actually turn it off as a sound source in the mixer, so it's just used as an LFO or even a faster oscillator to affect the sound of the other oscillators in the filter. Or you can use the noise source to do the same thing. Or, as you can see, this is a blend. We've got a wet dry between all oscillator 3 as the source, all noise as the source, or both. Now we'll hear this in a second. We'll move through the synth, we'll get a sound going, and we'll come back and explore these with actually sort of sound demos in a minute. But that's the idea of the controllers section. Okay, we've got glide, tune to make sure we're in tune with other instruments, and the mod mix to decide what the source of our modulation is. Now, as I say, the next thing we have is an oscillator modulation switch here. When it's there, it's off. And this modulation isn't sent to the oscillators. Over here, skipping ahead for a second, there is a similar one for the filter modulations, and that also is off. Currently could be on, back off again. So that's off. So we're going to hear the oscillators unaffected, and we'll get these working first, then we'll come back and just double check this area here. Oscillators, 1, 2, 3, labeled very clearly. Quite simply, we're hearing just oscillator 1 currently, so I can change the range here in octaves. And below 32, there is a low setting where the oscillator is used as an LFO. Clicks very, very slowly. On the other side of here, we have waveforms, so I can choose the sound the oscillator makes. We have a sawtooth currently. Go for a saw triangle, pure triangle, square, rectangle, and a narrow rectangle. Unlike some synths, Minimoog didn't do pulse width modulation. You had a variety of like 1, 2, 3 different pulse widths, the full 50 square, the narrow, and the super narrow there, okay? So there are your sound sources. Now, Arturia have added a sync option. I'm not going to look at that now. We'll stay with the original Moog. So moving on down, oscillator 2 is the same controls again, but one extra. We have a semitone range here. Now, in order to hear oscillator 2, we'll need to turn it up in the mixer. So I'll quickly do that now. I need to turn it on and turn it up. And now we can hear oscillator 2 as well. To make it clearer, I'll put it on a different. Okay, so oscillator 2, if I turn it down, there's our sawtooth, and there's oscillator 2 beneath. Now, oscillator 2, as well as being moved up in octaves, can be offset by individual notes. And if you use the control key and mouse, you can make very fine adjustments to create slight detunings. If I put the 2 back on the same octave, you'll hear that clearer. You hear a very slow drift in that tone, getting thinner. And that's because they're slightly out of tune with each other. And we have the same again on oscillator 3. We also have, oscillator 2 and oscillator 3 have these switches, OSC2 control, OSC3 control. Now, when these are on, pushed in at the top, it means that oscillator 2, for example, in this case, tracks the keyboard. If I turn it off, you can hear, I'll turn oscillator 1 down, you can hear this. Regardless of what note I play, oscillator 2 doesn't have any change. It stays at whatever pitch is set with the knobs here. Put one back on again, you'll hear. So these switches let you take 2 or 3 away from being controlled by the keyboard. They become constant pitch oscillators, okay? The reason for that in the original Moog's design, there was only one of these switches in the original, on oscillator 3. It was so you could turn 3 into a modulation source that didn't change depending on the note you were playing. Let's say you're using 3 to kind of open and close the filter. As you play different notes, it's going to get faster or slower. If you want it to be static, have a constant go jug, 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 jug on your filter that doesn't keep altering, then you take it out of the keyboard mode, and then this is static. That's the reason for it. It's also rather handy for making these very strange synth patches, but if you want to make that kind of thing, this is how you do it. Wonderful kind of electronic electro vibes. So that is the oscillator section. And from here, they're fed into the mixer. We've got 1, 2, 3 volume controls for each of the 1, 2, 3 oscillators. We've also got 2 more here, a volume control for external input, so we can feed a sound into the mixer, and noise volume, we can add white or pink noise. So it's pretty straightforward. These switches allow us to turn any of these sources on or off. So currently we've got 1 on, we've got oscillator 2 on, we've got oscillator 3 off. So let's quickly see if we turn that on, what happens. So there's our existing sound. I'll turn 3 on, nothing until you give it some volume. Okay, now we've got oscillator 3 on that very deep low setting, so I'll bring it up a bit. It's also not responding to the keyboard, so I'll switch that in. And I can balance that in using the volume. The two other parameters, external input and noise, work exactly the same way if I turn noise on. There's a switch here for white or pink noise. Pink noise is just a darker version. Less bright. External input lets you route a sound into the plugin in exactly the same way that on the real instrument you could plug an instrument into the input jack on the back. There's an extra setting on here. Normally we have just off or on, but there's also a setting here out. Now what that is there was a groovy trick on the Minimoog where you could take the output of the whole sound of the synth from its headphone out and stick it round the back into its input jack and then bring it back into the synth, creating a feedback loop. So we can do that here. If we set it onto off or on, that's as usual, but if we set in the middle, we get out. So that is the output fed back in to the input. And if I bring this up, you'll see we get this feedback loop. Now, the other thing you'll notice quite quickly is that when we use this feedback loop, it very easily overloads, and hence we have this overload light here. Rather frustratingly, the way Arturia have designed the front panel here, whenever you hover on the external input volume, the readout of the minus 200 dB there, it hides the overload light. So it's a bit frustrating. But anyway, this is what happens to the sound. And you can hear that. I'll get this mouse out of the way and watch the overload light. It's overloading the feedback loops, creating a pretty horrible hum. And it's just overwhelming the sound. It's handy if you want to have that, but in reality, the way the Minimoog behaved was this setting over here, which wasn't on the original, it was just the way it was, is a soft clipping switch, which means that an overload is a far more sort of harmonious and gentle sounding thing rather than just a horrible blatter of noise. So you'll hear now as I bring up the external input volume for that feedback loop. And there you go, it's a much more musically useful thing. You still can, if you want to, like really push that hard, start to get that complete mess. But even that's still more useful than the soft clipping off. But it's there if you do need it. And that's the mixer section. We're back in a minute and look at the filters, modifiers, and output.
Thanks everybody for watching, commenting, and indeed liking. We really do appreciate all the support we get here on our Sonic Academy YouTube channel. So if you found this video super useful, please, we'd love you to hit the subscribe button. We update the YouTube channel every week with new content. And if you want to watch some more relevant content, just click on the videos beside me.